Christmas Cold Case by Sarah Hamaker. All she wants for Christmas is to solve her parents' murders and stay alive. Noelle Chastain has returned to Twin Oaks to discover who killed her parents 30 years ago. When the Shenandoah County Sheriff's Office declines to reopen the cold case, citing lack of new evidence, attorney David Keener steps in to help her search and keep her safe from someone who doesn't want her digging up the past. Will they find out who's behind the increasingly personal attacks on Noelle before she suffers the same fate as her parents? Now an excerpt from Christmas Cold Case by Sarah Hamaker. As David Keener stuffed files into his briefcase, Main Street's twinkling lights outside his office window reminded him how much Christmas shopping he had to do. Might as well finish work at home in his slippers, then knock out some gifts. Good thing Amazon delivered round the clock this time of year. He tried not to resent the law firm's two principal partners at Zucker, Lee & Associates enjoying their annual December fishing trip off the Cayman Islands. Seeing the blue sky and turquoise waters behind Paul Zucker Jr. and Neil Lee during the morning staff meeting held via Zoom did little to alleviate the stress of overseeing the firm's caseload. As the senior associate, it fell on him to shepherd the two junior attorneys through the divorces, real estate dealings, and estate plannings that were the firm's bread and butter. As a general practice law firm, Zucker, Lee & Associates handled a wide variety of cases. But lately, David had been chafing at the influx of messy divorces and squabbling siblings. He wrapped his scarf around his neck and slipped on his overcoat. Opening the door, he heard his administrative assistant, Sherry Lane, talking on the office phone. David put his head down, not wanting to get sucked into one more thing when Home and Hearth beckoned. "Mr. Keener?" Despite having worked for him for 2 years, Sherry insisted on calling him Mr. Keener in public and private. He'd given up trying to convince her David would do, especially with no clients around. "Yes?" She put her hand over the receiver. "There's someone in the Holly place on Sycamore." He sighed. "Mrs. Coates?" Sherry nodded, her hand still over the mouthpiece. "She says there's lights inside the house." "Tell her I'll stop by on my way home." He returned to his office to grab the keys to the house in question. The firm had been looking after the property for several decades until the owner decided what to do with it. Mrs. Coates lived across from the Holly property, and she kept an eagle eye on everything happening on her street. With the property sitting empty after the last tenants moved out a few weeks ago, maybe some teens thought it would be cool to see where a double murder was committed there on Christmas Day years ago. Ever since Zucker Sr. had retired 6 years ago, it fell under David's purview to manage the rental property. Sherry had her coat on when he relocked his office door. "Thanks for checking. Mrs. Coates seemed ever so sure this time." He shrugged. "All part of the services here at Zucker, Lee & Associates." She smiled as she gathered her purse, then snapped off the desk lamp. "Are you going to the lighting of the Christmas tree?" "That's tonight?" He'd lost track of days, stuck in the office until long after dinner most nights. "Maybe." He followed her out and locked the outer office door, waving goodbye as he walked to his car in the small lot behind the building. Since he lived a few blocks away from the office, he rarely bothered to drive, but an early morning call to a farmer who lived 10 miles from town had necessitated taking his Land Rover. Now he was glad he had, since it would mean getting home quicker after stopping at 2935 Sycamore Avenue. 5 minutes later, he pulled to the curb in front of the property. Cutting the engine and lights, he peered through the line of trees, now devoid of their leaves, to the house. He'd always liked the folk Victorian building with its bright blue siding and columned wraparound porch. He'd better do a thorough search, or Mrs. Coates would phone 911 next. He turned up the collar of his coat as he walked down the gravel driveway with his phone's flashlight illuminating his way. Approaching the house, a flashlight beam in one of the upstairs windows caught his attention. When he was on the porch, a crash from inside the house jacked up his heart rate. This didn't sound like teenagers. Maybe he should call 911. But first, he'd check inside. He inserted the key, but the door swung inward. A cry propelled him into the darkened foyer. In front of him yawned the carved staircase to the second floor. Moonlight spilled in from the stained glass window on the landing, one of the home's more unique attributes. Two figures struggled there, both clad in dark clothes. He hit the light switch, but nothing happened. With a groan, he recalled the cleaner telling him the light near the front door wasn't working. Better call for help, then he could flip on the other foyer light switch located near the stairs. Not knowing which was the intruder or if this was a fight among thieves, he held his phone aloft. "I'm calling the sheriff!" He punched in 911 as the taller person shoved the shorter one hard against the wall, then dashed down the stairs straight for David. "Where's your emergency?" The 911 dispatcher's voice registered a split second before the person barreled into David, knocking him down and sending the phone spinning across the floor. He scrambled after it as the front door banged against the frame. After picking up the phone, he gave the address, then related what happened as succinctly as possible. "And send an ambulance, as I think someone might be hurt." "Sir, are you in a safe place to wait for emergency personnel?" He started up the stairs toward the stirring figure on the landing. "I'm approaching the other person now." "Sir, please do not put yourself in danger. A deputy will be arriving in 20 minutes, and the ambulance will be there in less than 5. He stopped a few steps from the landing as the figure slowly sat up, shoving a hand through shoulder-length curly hair. "I'll keep the line open," he told the dispatcher, then laid the phone on the step. "Are you okay?" The woman held her head between both hands. "Oh, he walloped me, but good." Her clipped accent told him she wasn't from Virginia. Probably somewhere north. Maybe one of the New England states. "I've called for an ambulance." "Yeah, I heard you." Her words were slightly muffled as she bent over, her hands cradling her head. "Well, I'm thankful you arrived when you did. What are you doing in my house?" The man with the curliest hair Noelle had ever seen, apart from her own twisty locks, crouched down. "Your house? This is the Holly place." That he knew the owner's name gave her the first inkling he might not be a random passerby. She stared straight into his eyes, brown like hers, behind dark framed glasses. "I know. I'm Noelle Holly Chastain." His brow furrowed as if trying to place her name. A siren split the air and he stood, turning toward the partially closed front door. When he swung back around, she couldn't discern his expression in the shadows. "The Christmas orphan?" The moniker an enterprising reporter had applied told her he'd read about her parents' murders on December 25th, 30 years earlier. She too rose, using the wall for support as her legs wobbled. "Yes, that's me." The siren sounded closer, and she caught a flash of red and white lights through the front door, followed by headlights as what she presumed must be the ambulance came up the driveway. "I should go meet them. Will you be okay here?" His concern touched her. She'd read about Southern politeness, but had yet to experience it for herself. "I think so." He touched her elbow. "Maybe you should sit down until the EMTs check you out. You might have knocked your head harder than you realized." Good idea." Using the banister post for help, she slid down onto the landing, placing her feet on the top step. From her vantage point, she had a clear view of the driveway through the open front door. The emergency vehicle pulled to a stop, and with one more look at her, the man hurried down the stairs and out the door. Noelle leaned her aching head against the post and closed her eyes. It had seemed like such a good idea 3 days ago. drive down to Virginia and face her past. However, things hadn't gone quite like she expected. Her great-great-aunt Mabel's words haunted her. "There's a reason folks say let sleeping dogs lie. They don't want to get bit." But Mabel was gone, the good Lord finally calling his servant home after a long and eventful life. At 97, Mabel's mind had been as sharp as Noelle's own, but her body hadn't been able to keep up. She still marveled that Mabel had said yes without hesitation when the social worker had called, asking about placing the 1-year-old Noelle with the then 67-year-old Mabel, her father's great-aunt. Over the years, Mabel hadn't shared much about her mother's family, only that they had refused to even see their grandchild, having washed their hands of Juliet Montgomery when she'd married Tyrone Hawley. "Miss?" An unfamiliar female voice brought her back to the present. She opened her eyes, glad the room didn't spin as it had after the intruder had slammed her into the wall. A woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense tilt to her head stared back. "I'm Jane, one of the EMTs. Let's see what's going on with you." Noelle answered the EMT's questions as Jane took her vitals and checked her head. "I don't think you'll have a bump, but if you experience prolonged dizziness or your headache doesn't go away with over-the-counter pain meds, you should go to the hospital." Jane tucked the blood pressure cuff back into her case. "If you want to take something for your headache, only acetaminophen for the first 24 hours. Then you can take ibuprofen or naproxen sodium." "Got it." Voices at the foot of the stairs snagged her attention. The man who'd come to her rescue stood with a pair of deputies in the now bright foyer. "He's single." Jane gestured toward her rescuer. "David Keener, attorney and one of Twin Oaks' most eligible bachelors." She ignored the latter part of Jane's introduction. "He's a lawyer?" Before Jane could reply, David approached the bottom of the stairs. "All finished, Jane?" "She's all yours." Jane winked before hefting her case and starting down the stairs. "Go easy on her, counselor. She's nursing a bit of a headache." Noelle pushed to her feet as David climbed the stairs. "I'll be okay." "Why don't we go into the kitchen for a glass of water? The deputies have some questions for you." She followed him down the stairs, snagging her shoulder bag from where she'd left it underneath a small table in the foyer. The kitchen could have been a stand-in for any 1970s movie set with its avocado-colored appliances and wood-paneled cabinets. She took a seat at the round table while David opened a cabinet and removed a glass. "You come here often?" Her question sounded strange, but she was curious at his apparent ease in the house that should have felt familiar to her, but instead made her uneasy and prickly. "I handled the management side of things when this was a rental." He carried a glass filled with tap water to her as one of the deputies entered the room. "I'm David Keener with Zucker, Lee & Associates. We're the law firm contracted to look after the place." "Oh, right. I found some correspondence about that among Mabel's papers." She fished in her bag for some Tylenol, downing 2 pills with a long swallow of water. David pulled out a chair to her right, and the deputy sat down across from her. David introduced the stocky man with a buzz cut and a neck tattoo peeking up from his uniform collar as Deputy Thomas Palin. Noelle gave her name and Boston address, her nerves humming as the preliminaries brought her closer to saying why she'd come to Virginia. "What brings you to Twin Oaks?" Palin had a very direct gaze, his dark eyes pinning her to her seat. Noelle wrapped her hands around the half-empty water glass and let out a breath. "I came to find out who murdered my parents."